My name is Mrs. Natalie Watson, and I'm 29 years old. I live in a small apartment with my husband. We've been married for 3 years and generally get along well. I say generally because I've become unhappy with my husband over the past few years. To be more precise, it's not just my husband, but also his parents. My husband and his parents have a great relationship, and we visit their house about once a week. At first, when I was taken to my in-laws' house, I thought, he's such a filial person. However, every time I went to their house, my in-laws repeatedly said, "Natalie, when will you quit your job? A woman's job is to take care of the home." Gradually, I started to dislike going to their house. I enjoy my current job and want to keep working as long as I can. I told my husband this before we got married. Even when his parents blame me, my husband doesn't even make eye contact, acting as if it doesn't concern him. I started to dread going to my in-laws' house, and there were times when I told my husband, "Why don't you just go by yourself?" However, my husband would say, "My parents want to see you too," and force me to go with him. Eventually, I gave up trying to convince him otherwise. However, I couldn't bring myself to say this to his parents, as it might hurt my husband's feelings. But I couldn't bring myself to tell his parents that, as it might hurt my husband's feelings. In the end, all I could do was smile and brush off their comments each time. While I disliked my husband's indifferent attitude, what I hated most was being asked by his parents, "When will you have a child?" I, myself, like kids and thought it would be nice to have one. However, you can't force a child to be born, and it's not something that can be easily done just by wanting it. First of all, I couldn't understand the idea of having a child just for his parents' sake. Honestly, I wanted them to leave me alone. I talked to my husband about this issue as well, but he just said, "Don't worry about it, they're just concerned," and didn't do anything. As my frustration built up due to my husband's attitude, and the fact that I had to endure this situation alone, my mother-in-law said something I couldn't bear. She asked, "Are you infertile since you still haven't had a child?" On top of that, my father-in-law looked at me as if I were a criminal, saying, "Did you keep your infertility a secret and marry our son?" I couldn't stand it anymore. Until now, I had endured and overcome anything they had said with a smile, but I stopped smiling and said to them, "I'll undergo infertility treatment. In return, can you promise not to bring this up again?" I was surprised by my own words, but I realized how stressed I had been. Suddenly, my previously silent husband spoke up. "I don't think we need fertility treatments. We're still young. There's no need to force ourselves to have a child. Fertility treatments cost money, and I want to cherish our time as a couple," he said firmly to his parents. At that time, I interpreted my husband's words to suit my convenience, and believed that he was thinking of me when he said that. On a certain weekday, I took paid leave and headed to the gynecologist. The concern of being nagged by his parents about having a child had decreased, but I wanted to be sure if I was really infertile. At first, I thought of asking my husband, but he became moody whenever I tried to talk about infertility treatments, so I decided to take the exam by myself. The examination finished quicker than I thought, and I scheduled an appointment for the results a week later. On my way out, I happened to meet eyes with a pregnant woman in the waiting room. I recognized her face and stopped in my tracks. She seemed to notice me right away and approached me. "Are you, by any chance, Natalie? Could it be Claire?" When we called each other's names, she nodded, confirming that she was indeed my classmate from elementary and middle school. Claire's belly was quite big, and she was 9 months pregnant. She had just finished her regular checkup, so I decided to visit her house while walking her home. Claire's house was close to mine, and I was surprised by that, but I was even more surprised to learn that her husband and my husband worked at the same company. Catching up on our current lives and chatting about our school days, my eyes were naturally drawn to Claire's belly. Noticing my stare, she asked, "Do you want to touch it?" "Is it okay?" I asked back, and she replied, "Of course." I gently touched Claire's belly. In my memory, Claire had a great figure with a slim waist, but now her body had grown so much. I was filled with amazement and the wonder that there really was a baby inside her. After keeping my hand on her belly for a while, I felt a faint movement when I tried to pull away. Surprised, I looked up at Claire. Did it just... Yeah, it started moving recently. That's amazing. Yeah. Claire, who happily stroked her belly, already had the face of a mother. Before I knew it, I found myself saying, I'm envious. I made a face as if I'd said something I shouldn't have, and quickly looked away from Claire. Claire, sensitive to people's emotions, seemed to have noticed enough and asked, If I'm misunderstanding, I apologize, but did something happen? I hesitated to talk about it, but I thought I couldn't deceive Claire's eyes, so I told her about the situation with my in-laws and children. Once I started talking, I couldn't stop, and I ended up telling her everything, including the fertility test I had taken at the clinic today. I thought maybe I'd said too much, but a strange sense of trust prevailed, making me believe it was okay to talk to Claire about it. Above all, I think I wanted someone to hear my pent-up frustrations from the past few years. While I talked, Claire just nodded and listened quietly. After I finished talking, Claire said, You've been holding back for so long. You endured it well. If it were me, I couldn't have held back and would have cut ties with my in-laws. Yeah, I just realized it now, but it seems I've been under a lot of stress. I feel a bit relieved after talking to you, Claire. At least my husband stood by my side, which was a small consolation. I said that with a light laugh, but Claire's expression remained tense. I was perplexed because I didn't know why Claire was making such a face, so I called her name. Then, she hesitated for a moment before reluctantly opening her mouth to speak. It's about your husband. Anyway, it might be better not to tell him about the test for now, Claire said with hesitation. Huh? I blinked at Claire's unexpected words. Curious about why Claire said those words, I asked her directly. Then, Claire started to tell me something astonishing. I couldn't digest what she said, and I somehow made it home with unsteady steps. Ever since I got home, I had been sitting on the sofa, pondering over what Claire had told me. I didn't want to believe it, but I also couldn't imagine Claire lying about something like that. Moreover, I had been feeling doubtful about my husband's behavior. If what Claire said was true, I couldn't forgive him. I made up my mind and decided to find out the truth. My husband and I were visiting my in-laws after a long time. As my husband and in-laws were eating tea and snacks, my mother-in-law suddenly asked, So, when will you quit your job, Natalie? Until now, I would have replied, I don't have plans to quit yet, but this time was different. I suppose I'll quit when we have a child, I replied. Hearing that, my mother-in-law blinked and said, Well, you finally decided to have a child. My father-in-law also excitedly said, Ooh, will I finally get to hold a grandchild? But my husband, after glancing at my face for a moment, made a don't say unnecessary things expression and said, Well, having a child is a blessing, so we don't know if it'll happen right away. As expected, my husband reacted the way I thought he would. I glanced at him and said, Actually, I went to the gynecologist the other day and showed him the results of my infertility test. It stated that there were no issues. I spoke to my husband before he could say anything. I'm starting to want a child, too. You'll cooperate for the sake of your parents, right? My husband looked back and forth between the test results and my face, then turned bright red and yelled, I'm not taking any infertility treatments. I won't get tested either. His parents were shocked by his sudden change, but I understood that what Claire had said was true and felt disappointed. Hey, do you know Mr. Howard? When I asked, my husband looked surprised, wondering how I knew. I decided to tell him without waiting for his response. His wife is my friend. Apparently, you've been saying things at work like, my wife is a defective product who can't have children due to infertility. She's abandoned being a woman and only focuses on work. And I'm so pitiful to have married such a wife. As I looked at him with a cold gaze I had never directed at him before, his mouth trembled and he became defensive. So what if it's true? Who else would want someone like you? Watching my furious husband, I felt my feelings for him cooling down. Rather, I started to wonder what I ever saw in a man like this. Calmly, I pointed at the test results on the table and said, "I just proved there's no problem with me, right?" While my husband stayed silent, I brought up something that had been bothering me in the back of my mind. "Could it be that you're the one with issues? Is that why you've been stubbornly refusing infertility treatments and testing?" That's when my mother-in-law, who had been silent, chimed in. "There's no way that's true. There's no way there's a problem with my son. If there's a problem, it's with you." With her face turning red, she grabbed the test results on the table and said, "These must be fake," and tore them up. My husband looked surprised at his mother's actions, but then he agreed. "Yeah, that's right. There's no way I have a problem." He and his parents started to blame me. Realizing there was no point in continuing the conversation, I slammed the prepared divorce papers on the table. "Then please divorce me. And why don't you find a much better wife than someone like me?" With that, my husband said, "Yeah, that's right. I'll find a much better wife than you," and angrily filled out the divorce papers. His parents didn't try to stop him. As I emotionlessly watched the divorce papers being filled out, I felt a sense of joy at severing ties with the 3 people in front of me. Once he finished, I quickly snatched the papers, said, "Well then, goodbye," and hurried out of my in-laws' house. I thought I heard a voice behind me, but it must have been my imagination. I headed straight to the city hall and quickly submitted the divorce papers. A few days later, I quickly moved out of the apartment we had been living in together and moved into my company dormitory. Since I was the only one who had signed the lease for the apartment and had already prepared for this day, the move went smoothly. By the way, I packed my husband's belongings in cardboard boxes and sent them to his parents' house with cash on delivery. When I started getting used to life in the company dormitory, I got a call from my ex-husband. Wondering what he wanted now, I answered the phone only to be yelled at right away. "Why did you submit the divorce papers? Why did you move out of the apartment?" I really want to ask why he was bringing this up now. I explained calmly, "Don't say things that don't make sense. You agreed and filled out the divorce papers, right? And as for the apartment, I was the one who originally signed the lease. And since we're divorced, I moved out because it's no longer necessary." However, my ex-husband didn't listen to me. "Take back the divorce. No, let's go submit new marriage papers. Where are you living now? Let's live together again." He continued to say even more disjointed things. I couldn't take it anymore, so I said, "Okay, I'm hanging up now. Don't ever call me again." I tried to end the call, but my ex-husband threatened, "If you don't tell me where you're living, I'll go to your company." I was fed up and just told him, "You're the one who'll be in trouble if you cause any problems," and hung up on the phone. Nevertheless, I couldn't be sure that he wouldn't come to the company, so I talked to my boss about my ex-husband just in case. Neither my boss nor I thought he would actually do anything, but he ended up causing a scene. I learned from the security guard that he went wild in the company lobby, and the police had to be called in the end. I was full of shame and guilt, but my coworkers sympathized with me and told me that breaking up with him was the right decision. Later, I heard from Claire's husband that my ex-husband had panicked when the police incident became known to his company and tried to make me the villain. However, Claire's husband corrected the story, and the lies my ex-husband had been telling about me were exposed. It seems he found it difficult to stay at the company and quit. Most likely, my jobless ex-husband is now back at his parents' house, crying to them. Honestly, even though it might be a case of you reap what you sow, I think it would be tough to support a son who has become unemployed and divorced. Well, it doesn't really matter to me anymore, since he is a stranger now. Since then, I've been free from unnecessary stress and spending my days focused on work. I have more time and money to spend freely, so I occasionally visit Claire to check on her, and we make plans to spoil her baby. She sometimes finds this amusing and shakes her head at me. As for getting remarried myself, I don't have the luxury to think about it just yet, but I do hope that someday I can have a happy family of my own.